Oh, I stayed up way too late last night editing photos for Selma, and now I've got to go to the city of Clovis, the city hall, city council chambers, and help them with some video setup out there.
2 hours later.
All right, got City of Clovis folks set up with an A10 Mini Pro and got all their graphics loaded in so they can go do live events, or when the mayor wants to talk to folks, go live to Facebook and YouTube. They're all set. I'm going to go eat lunch before I go head over to CMAC. Oh, that's not the worst. I took some calls and I have to head to CMAC soon, but before I do, I wanted to share my thoughts a little bit about this camera that I borrowed from my brother. So last night for the Selma Art Center photo shoot, I did close-up photos with the Nikon Z50 and the Nikon 70-300 with the FTZ adapter. I did wide-angle photos with the EOS R and the Sigma 20mm. And then I did slow motion video clips with the C70. And I think that kind of worked well. I don't do a lot of photo gigs right now, but I typically like to cover events with two cameras, one with a wide angle lens and another with a long telephoto lens, and kind of get everything from wide to close. Probably should have done more of like a 24-70 on the EOS R, but I don't have a 24-70 right now. And the 20 being wider than 24 gets some really fun wide angles. So I think those turned out pretty nice. The Nikon Z50, I haven't used a Nikon stills camera in a very long time. And this being a, mirrorless camera, even some things are more different. For the first 10 minutes, I was twisting the zoom the wrong way because it goes the opposite way of Canon. I also had a hard time figuring out how to set my ISO to automatic and then set exposure compensation. There's an ISO button and exposure compensation, and like most the APS-C cameras that I've used, you kind of hold the button and you turn the dial, but I couldn't figure out where to put ISO on auto. So it turns out if you hold the ISO button and do the back wheel, that takes you from 0 to the highest ISO that you can go to. But you'd have to hold the button and use the front wheel, which this was a little wheel wonky to do. Hold this button and then turn this wheel. Am I using my thumb? Am I using my index finger, my middle finger to toggle between auto ISO and, a manual ISO? Because that's what I do when I'm doing theater stuff like that. I usually keep it in manual, set my shutter speed somewhere 200, 250, where I can freeze most of the action, but really big action still has some motion blur to it. And then I just try to keep my lens as open as possible because the theater lighting changes so quickly. But you could go from a really bright scene, if they're trying to emulate daylight, they just blast all of their white lights. And then they do something like later that day, evening or nighttime, and they're using 10% of the light, which I'd have to change settings really, really quickly. So I usually run manual shutter speed and aperture, but then let my ISO be automatic. Now I find that Canon cameras tend to expose a little brighter than I would like for theater, especially with quick turnaround stuff. I don't want really blown out highlights. So I turn my exposure compensation down 1/3 or 2/3. But I was feeling like the Nikon Z50 in auto ISO and exposure compensation was a little on the darker side. So I think I ended up leaving my exposure compensation at 0. I think the photos that came out of the camera and this lens, especially in those kind of darker situations where, the lens would go from 4.5 to 5.6 as I zoomed in on the aperture change, it handled it fairly well. Some of the photos were grainier and darker than I would have liked, but again, it's an APS-C camera and it's a variable aperture lens. I knew what I was getting into when I picked this up. I was just mostly interested to try it all out. But the color out of the camera, I just had it on the standard picture profile. The color's solid. The photos are nice and punchy. They have good saturation to them right out of the camera. Although the raw files I needed to convert to DNG so I could sort them on my iPad. that's fine. That's always something tricky with a new camera, newish camera. A couple of things I didn't like though. I really wished this had an articulating screen. You know, you can flip it almost all the way down. You can, you know, get it up. Most of the time I had the EVF up to my eye, but you know, I could see this being really popular. It's light camera. You put a wide angle lens on it. It could be a great vlogging camera. The upcoming Nikon FC, which is essentially a Z50, but in a retro style body, does have an articulating screen, but at the added cost of $100 and no extra like hardware, software features beyond that. I also felt that the like battery door, SD card door is kind of flimsy. It doesn't quite, you know, you pull the thing and then you really got to manually move it. There's no spring loaded action to keep it open. It was just kind of tricky to do battery changes, although I had a large enough SD card to run the whole show. I also wish this camera had 4K 60. Again, you know, like the articulating screen, I think if someone wanted to use this as a hybrid photo and video person, 4K 24 and 4K 30 looks pretty good. I did a couple short clips with it. It looks fine. But I think I want a little bit of slow motion. 60 frames per second at 4K. Even 120 would be fantastic, but I would settle for 60. I think that would be really nice. They don't typically add that sort of stuff with the firmware update. Just maybe if there's a Z50 Mark II or a Z60, I would love to see higher frame rates at 4K come to this camera. And my last little nitpick was this camera takes a little while longer to boot up. Maybe it doesn't have as fast of a processor as the Z6, Z7, even my EOS R. But I would pick it up and I would swap between the cameras. So I'd set it down. I'd take some photos with the EOS R, but then I'd pick up this camera and I would have to half press the shutter because I would leave it on, but I would half press the shutter to wake it up, and it was taking longer than I wanted. So I had to get in the habit as I picked it up, I pressed the shutter as it's coming up into my hand, up to my eye, and even then it was still like another second before it was on. So I think this has like a boot up, maybe 3.5 seconds. It would have been nicer if it was a little bit faster because I feel like I was falling behind or missing some moments waiting for the camera to wake up from sleep. But yeah, most of the time I left it on. I didn't really I turned it off at intermission to let it cool off, but then I turned it back on, and yeah, letting it go to sleep is fine. Save the battery. Don't need the EVF and the screen on all the time, but I want it to boot up. I want to half press and have it like immediately be ready to go. So those are some of my nitpicks. I think it's a decent camera for the price. Good pictures, good video for what it does. I wish it did more. I wish it did 4K 60. I wish it had an articulating screen. I wish it booted up faster. It's aside from the big honking lens, it's comfortable enough in my hand, and I've got long fingers. So yeah, Z50, if you're looking for an entry-level mirrorless camera and you like Nikon, I don't think it's bad, but it doesn't do everything that I want, so it's not for me. But thank you, Brandon, for letting me borrow it, try it out on a production, and you know, we'll see where it goes from here. I'm headed off to CMAC, going to produce an episode of the Monroe Review. It's going to be the first time we've done an episode in the CMAC studio in a year and a half.
What follows is a brief construction montage.
We're setting up a wacky inflatable tube man, or a screen. Oh yeah, it's a screen. That's huge. Sandbags. Need sandbags. It's 8:15 and it is not dark enough. The sun is just setting. It's 8:40. It's looking a little better. And Brian left, so I picked cats. Bye, Rocky! All right, we just finished testing the projector and the screen. I think it's gonna work. We have to wait till it gets dark, but that'll be for the Arte Americas project next week. And the Monroe review went great. Maricela killed it as director. My car's beeping at me, so I better go. Call it a night. See you tomorrow. Peace.